Hello, everyone, and I'm super excited to be with Anil Seth today. This has been a year in the making, a conversation a year in the making, but truly Anil is an inspiration because he has helped me take the veil out of what reality truly is. He is an expert in consciousness, in neuroscience, and he argues that we collectively hallucinate reality. So it's going to be a fun one. Thank you, Neil, for joining me today.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here, finally.
Yes. Your newest book, Being You, the cover, it's an eye, and it's being you. So tell me about the eye. Why is the eye always related with consciousness?
It's interesting that was the cover. It's in a sense, we're very visual creatures. So when we think about consciousness, it's very tempting to start by thinking about visual experience. It's not a bad thing to do. We know quite a bit about the visual system. We can do experiments in the lab that manipulate visual experience. It's still hard, but it's easier with vision than with other things. We can make certain things unconscious and other things conscious. So by taking vision as a starting point, we can develop ideas that then can apply to consciousness more generally. In fact, though, what I really think is at the heart of consciousness is the body and the perception and regulation of the body. And one of the themes that I try to draw out in the book is that the way we experience being a self, this title of the book, this being you, that's built by the brain according to the same principles or very, very similar principles to how the brain constructs our visual experience of the outside world. It's just that when you come to looking for a book cover, it's you have to have something that also looks nice and is dramatic on the when you see it on a shelf, and we ended up with an eye.
Yeah, and the eye truly in itself reveals our inner self in a way. And what I love about being you and what you've been arguing for the past your whole career is that consciousness is this thread of our own personal narrative and our own timeline as we begin to unfold who we are and our past experiences. But in being you argue that this may not be the case, that consciousness may not be just this singular timeline happening throughout your whole life. So what does that mean? Does that mean that right now, who am I right now with you, talking with you, is not the same that I was a year ago, 2 years ago?
I think probably not. One of the interesting things about the experience of being someone is that it seems unified and it seems stable. So the experience of being anyone, being me or being you, does seem to be one thing, but there are many, many different aspects to it. And I'm certainly not the first person to observe this, not by any means. I mean, you can go back in philosophy as far as you like to Hume, who talks about the self as a bundle of perceptions. He has this bundle theory of self. And I was greatly influenced by two other philosophers, Thomas Metzinger, who has a book with a sort of complementary title called Being No One, which of course you can think of my book as a bit of a tribute to, and Daniel Dennett, who talked about the self as a center of narrative gravity, which is a lovely metaphor for just what you were saying, that one way to think of the self is as this thread of memories and ideas and thoughts with no particular place that it all comes together. But there's just these things going on all the time, and they have a center of gravity just as any object does. And that's what we experience as being the self. My view is very, very related to both Metzinger and Dennett and back to Hume, that there are many aspects of being a self. It's not all just the memories and thoughts, the things that you would most closely associate with the I.
Yes.
Again, this is another reason why there's an eye on the cover. It's not just the eye of vision, there's the eye of the self too. And so that's one level. And that's the level we colloquially talk about. If I say who I am, if I ask you who you are, you typically think in terms of your name and the memories that you have, your goals, what your personal history. your relationships with other people, these cultural and social aspects of self. But underneath that, there are things that are equally, if not more, foundational to the experience of being a self. And these are things like the experience of intending to do things, of causing things to happen, what we typically associate with free will. There are experiences of seeing the world or perceiving the world from a first-person perspective. Then, even below that, there's kind of a hierarchy here of sorts. Below that, there are experiences of being a body, being associated with the particular object in the world that is the body. And I think the most fundamental aspect of self is simply the experience of being a living organism, of being alive. That's where self, for me, bottoms out. It's very difficult to describe that feeling, but I'm sure we'll get there later. But if you think about very briefly what brains are for, they're for keeping the body alive. And the idea that I've been developing and develop in the book is that all our mechanisms of perception all have their origin in predictions that the brain makes that originated in development and evolution in order to regulate the messy physiology of the body itself.
Wow, that's amazing. And it comes to the idea, you mentioned Daniel Dennett, and he argues that consciousness, or the notion of consciousness, might be just this survival technique deriving from evolution, which I suspect is kind of the idea that you put out in Being You, in your perspective on what consciousness is. And you mentioned something interesting right now, Anil. You associated being you with that same word, with it's associated with your body. So I think that for me, as you know, I get often confused because I have both the ideas that I am a consciousness within a body. Do you believe that they're a different thing? Is consciousness not within the body? Are we in the Philip Goff's philosophy of panpsychism? Or where does consciousness rely on? What is it?
So, well, I'm not in the Philip Goff world of panpsychism. I like Philip very much, and we have quite energetic debates about this, but I am absolutely unconvinced that panpsychism is either true, coherent, or useful. I don't think it's any of these things. Panpsychism is, of course, the idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous in nature, like mass or energy. The question, one way to think about the question you just asked, it's a very good question, is what is what's the constitutive basis of consciousness? On what does it actually rely in the world? Which is a different question from saying what shapes our conscious experiences, what makes us who we are, and what makes our experiences of the world the way they are. I think there's very, very compelling evidence that the constitutive basis of consciousness is in the brain. The brain, put the brain in a particular state, and there will be a conscious experience. But the states that give rise to consciousness, or that are identical to consciousness, they may also then depend on the body and on the world. So the way in which consciousness happens, and maybe it's even necessary to get the brain into any state compatible with consciousness, there very likely has to be a history of embodied interaction with the wider world. So it's a bit subtle, but it's very useful to draw out these different senses about what's necessary and what's sufficient. There's what's necessary and or sufficient at one time. And here I think, put the brain into the right state, consciousness happens. But maybe over time, you need the body in the world as well. And you certainly need the body in the world in order to explain why we experience things the way we do.
Wow. That's an amazing thought. And it makes me think of, on a personal level, for us both, we have given I don't know if for you it's a gift or a curse of consciousness. We're aware of ourselves. We're aware that we're aware. It's a meta-awareness. And one of the things that, if I'm being 100% honest, is I'm frightened to to finally realize through science, through evidence, that consciousness might be just a mechanical process. Because for me, this idea of it's something magical, it's something above us, gives spark to life. So my question is, what are the benefits for you, Anil, that if we unveil what consciousness truly is? What may come in my personal life out of that idea?
This is a very important question. It's not asked often enough, I think. And I think it's admirable of you to put it out there very transparently, that the idea that there might be a scientific explanation of consciousness could be somehow threatening. It's something to be a little bit frightened of, because if then what are we? If there's no mystery anymore, then do we not just sort of dissolve in our importance to ourselves and the world? I just don't think that's likely to happen, and there are several reasons for that. Well, firstly, it's not a good motivation on which to base what you think about how to explain consciousness. The idea that preserving mystery as a good thing should not guide our scientific thinking or philosophical thinking in ways that sort of attempt to preserve that mysterious nature. So here, things that sort of still appeal to dualism or even panpsychism in a way, I think are a bit guilty of that. But having an explanation of consciousness and of self that makes these things explicable in terms of mechanisms, for me, that's a positive thing. At least I think it will be a positive thing at the end of that road. Already it's a positive thing. In the history of science, there have been many examples in which an initial resistance to explaining something based on the idea that it would be threatening to how we see ourselves, maybe as a species, maybe as individuals, it never really turns out that way. So you think about, we've always, as humans, we've always tended to want to preserve something special and distinctive, something outside of nature, in order to feel good about ourselves. So we were at the center of the universe, and then Copernicus showed that we were not at the center of the universe. This was threatening to some people, for sure. It was certainly threatening to the religious authorities of the time. But I think you might agree that having the perspective on the universe that we now have, it's so much grander and awe-inspiring than it was when it was just a few planets rotating around us at the center.
Yes.
And the same thing you could say with Darwin, that the idea that we are related to all other animals, we share characteristics, both physical and mental, with other animals. Again, that's a threat to the idea that we're somehow apart from nature. But again, the picture of life on Earth that Darwin has given us, and Wallace and others, is so much richer than the anthropocentric, human-centric alternative. Why should it be any different with consciousness? I think once we understand how our conscious lives are woven into the tapestry of nature, that will empower us, not reduce us.
Wow. Thank you for that perspective. And I never thought about it that way, that this might be just another thread in the whole timeline of figuring out who we are and why are we here. And as you said, it's most of the discoveries, if not all, of the world that's around us, the mechanisms, have yielded great benefits. Do you think that what would be one of the biggest benefits that may arise from realizing what consciousness is? Would it be a medical thing? Would it be a technological aspect? More of a social welfare idea?
I think the biggest benefit follows on from what we were just talking about. There's an existential benefit to be had here, that we'll have a different perspective on our lives and the meaning of our lives, which I think can be very positive. It need really not be fatalistic at all, that when we understand that we're deeply part of nature. Yeah. And also that it depends on the particular theories that come up, but my particular ideas that again build on many others lead us to understand that our perceptual experience of the world is not a direct reflection of reality. It's a construction. It's guided. It's not arbitrary. It's guided, strongly constrained by the real world, but it's not identical to it. And the same thing goes for the self. This can be very, very helpful in dealing with the emotional turbulence of our everyday lives too. If we don't take the contents of our perceptual experience as being necessarily a direct window onto how they are, I think that offers a little space between our experiences as they unfold and the interpretations that we attach to them. In much the same way that meditation tries to do. I think that tries to, through practice, get you to something of the same place. So there's an existential benefit, but then you're right, there are other more immediate benefits of the sort that, if I was writing a grant application, I might have to put in about, okay, why is this a useful thing to do apart from just understanding things? And there's plenty of clinical potential here. There already has been medical advances made on the back of consciousness science, not my own work at all, but work by Giulio Tononi and Marcello Massimini has led to new ways of diagnosing residual awareness in brain-injured patients who, on the basis of their outward appearance, had been diagnosed as completely lacking in consciousness. This is massively important. There are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people who are in states that in neurology are called the vegetative state or the state unaware wakefulness state, typically thought of as being unconscious despite going through sleep and wake cycles. Until recently, the only way to diagnose these conditions was on the basis of outward responses to commands, to questions, and so on, or whether these people made any sort of intentional or voluntary action. And now we can just look inside the brain and there are new ways of, not infallible, but there are important new ways of diagnosing, or at least predicting whether there's residual awareness. In psychiatry, a deep understanding of what shapes our conscious experiences of the world and self can give us an insight into the mechanisms that underlie psychiatric symptoms. And I think we're still a long way from this translating into very, very everyday treatments. You're not going to get this immediately, but it's clearly the right way to go. And then practical application, technological applications too. Here, I think, without going too far into the weeds, there's a massive and important difference between quite hubristic attempts to build a conscious machine. For, we know from science fiction this is a pretty terrible idea. Things tend to go badly. But there's a lot to be gained from understanding how consciousness works to develop better human-computer interaction technologies and to augment artificial intelligence with some of the functions that we associate with consciousness. Now, that's not the same as building a conscious machine. It's just using insights from what consciousness allows us to do to solve some of the problems that the current AI.
Wow. And that's amazing. And I quickly associated, the whole notion of consciousness, realizing what is, and the ideas that you put out right now in terms of, of society itself. And I think of finally realizing what consciousness is. There's no way we cannot associate it with, maybe realizing that we might not have free will in the way that we always thought about. But we always have that conversation, that what's free will, what's not free will. So I would love to get into, more a practical situation, a scenario, and I would love to hear your thoughts, is that we realize that there's no free will. Consciousness is just this mechanism, and people, finally, people don't engage in the world as freely as we thought they would. So in a criminal scenario where someone commits a crime, how do we find out if the person is guilty or not? If I could argue, if I'm the lawyer, hey, you know what, he didn't do it by his own will. you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is not new. This has already happened, right? There are already cases in law where people have raised the defense, or their lawyers have raised the defense, that the person is not guilty because of and aspects of their neurobiology and aspects of what's happened to their brain. Currently, this has only been done in cases where it's pretty obvious. So there's a famous case, the case of Charles Whitman. He was, sadly, he was America's first mass school shooter back in the 1960s, I believe. And he seemed to have undergone a massive personality change. He was an engineering student. He was, and then, it's not entirely clear. His background is quite complicated, but certainly there was nothing necessarily to predict that he was going to go up, sit on the top of a tower at a university in Texas and shoot a lot of people. And that's exactly what he did. And he was himself shot by the police, but he'd left a note which asked for an autopsy to be done on his brain because he was having all these impulses and thoughts which were unrecognizable to him and very worrying. And an autopsy was done, and it was indeed found that he had a brain tumor. And this brain tumor was pressing on the amygdala in his brain, which is, as we know, is part of the brain that, among other roles, is strongly implicated in experiences of fear, of fight and flight responses, and so on. So it seems in this case reasonably plausible that the brain tumor was a sort of proximate cause of what Charles Whitman did. And if he had not had the brain tumor, he would not have shot a lot of people. We don't know that for sure, but it seems at least plausible.
Wow.
So in that case, you attempted to say, well, yeah, we don't hold him responsible. The challenge is that's a very sort of obvious example of how a change in the brain led to a change in behavior.
Yes.
But you can think, at some level, we're just brain tumors all the way down. The more we understand about the brain basis of voluntary action, then the more plausible it will be to say, okay, person X did this thing, not because they chose to do it, sort of independent of their biology, according to some very spooky version of free will, where free will just causes things to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, some immaterial free choice. But no, they did this because that's the way their brain was organized, and they did not choose to have that brain. They didn't decide that they would have the brain they ended up having. Yeah. So can we really hold them responsible? So it will get quite difficult. On the other hand, there are many reasons why you might assign responsibility of some sort. It's not just that you decide the person is guilty. There are good reasons for removing certain people from society, even if you don't think they're ultimately responsible for what they've done, if they pose sufficient danger for other people. But there's a range of philosophical views on this. Some of them, there's a philosopher called Bruce Waller who argues that any kind of punishment is basically now incoherent because it all rests on this idea that there's some sort of immaterial free will. But then, like Dan Dennett, again, has a more, I think, nuanced view that once people achieve some degree of competence to control their actions, then it makes sense to hold them responsible for those actions.
Wow. And I remember your now very, very, very famous and popular TED Talk where you showed your image of your campus on Sussex being, surrounded by these dogs. Everyone was watching dogs. And it's the argument that it's a collective hallucination, that our brain is figuring out reality as we go along. And I've tried to do that my own self, not with dogs, of course, but when you're in a dark room and if there's a painting and you watch the silhouettes and the shadows and everything, but you stare at the corner of the painting, it begins to fade. Mm-hmm. So it's like my little exercise of realizing that reality may not be as we think it is. So you think that reality in and of itself, or at least the collective way of thinking of reality, is close to reality, or it's just really an illusion far from it?
It's a very good question. I've got quite a lot of stick for the title of the TED Talk, because I think the TED Talk says we hallucinate our conscious reality. Now, I think that's strictly true, but it's often been misinterpreted as me saying that there's no relationship between what we experience and what's out there, that it's all just in the mind. Everything is a hallucination completely. I am absolutely not saying that at all. What we experience, sort of what I'm saying is, it's playing on this term that wasn't my term. I heard it from Chris Frith before me, and then it came from somewhere else, this idea of perception as a controlled hallucination. And the control is hugely important here. The hallucination part is the idea that what we perceive is not this direct readout of what's out there. It's a best guess. It's an inference about the causes of sensory signals. I think that's right. And hallucination is just a sort of an extreme example of that, when our best guesses are not controlled by the environment. They lose their grip on reality. And the control part is precisely that our perceptual best guesses are continually calibrated, continually updated by signals from the world. And that's why perception works. It's useful. If perception bore no relationship to what was actually out there, we wouldn't last very long as an individual or as a species.
Yeah.
So there's a very, very close relationship. However, there's a subtle point here, which I try to talk about in the book too, and I think about quite a lot. I mean, you can get very close in the sense that your perceptual system can be very, very sensitive to relevant sensory signals from the world. And that can be very useful for the organism. But this doesn't mean that your perception has to be completely accurate, that the best way to perceive the world would be the most accurate. In fact, that's almost certainly not the case. And others have made this point too. Donald Hoffman makes this point that we perceive the world not as it is, but as it's useful for us to do so.
Wow.
Full comprehensive accuracy is not necessarily the most useful thing to perceive. We need to highlight some things. We need to construct some aspects of our conscious world that will ultimately benefit the organism. Color is a very good example of this. So color, we experience as being a real property of the outside world. But we don't need neuroscience to know this. Newton tells us this, that colors don't exist as an objective, mind-independent property of the world. The brain constructs colors in order to help the organism behave. So if you ask, when we experience color, is that close to what's out there in the world? The question doesn't even make sense, because colors don't exist out there in the world anyway. They are constructed by our brains. So conscious experience in general is not the sort of thing that approximates reality or can be close to it, but it is controlled and guided by it in ways that can vary in their utility for the organism.
Anil, I may never see colors the same way from now on. I don't know.
But it's not, I mean, this is it's lovely, I think, when an insight like this, and it's been around for so long, artists know this. I mean, Cézanne has this beautiful quote that color is where the brain and the universe meet. And so I think it is a very rich example. And of course, you'll remember, and your listeners might remember too, this example of The Dress, which some people saw as blue and black and others as white and gold. A lovely example of how color is individually and uniquely constructed. And it caused such a storm around the internet precisely because people experience the color, not just as a particular color, but as really existing out there in the world. I see the dress as blue and black. How the hell can you see it as white and gold? And it's that tendency to reify, to be a bit boringly technical about it, but to treat as being real some properties of our experience that gets us into these awkward situations.
Wow. This might be a twist in the conversation. I'm just curious if your research has yielded any results on what I'm going to ask is, when are we truly aware or begin to be aware of consciousness? When are we born? When we're in the womb of our moms? Like, when does consciousness arise in an individual level?
It's a very difficult question. I don't think anybody really knows. It's similar to the question about which other animals, apart from humans, are conscious. There's a really important distinction to make here, though. It takes us back to what we were talking about a bit earlier. There's a big distinction between being conscious at all and being self-conscious, being aware at these higher levels, being aware of being an individual.
Yeah.
And it's very likely that the latter, this reflective self-awareness, being aware of being aware, comes quite late. And there's a classic test for this in psychology called the mirror test. And it's also used in a variety, or adapted to various non-human animals. And the idea is that if a baby or a toddler or an animal reacts to a mirror image of itself in a way that demonstrates it recognizes that the image is an image of itself, then it must have some awareness of itself as an individual. So in practice, this means, you put a mark on the body, maybe on the forehead. Does the toddler or baby investigate the image on the mirror, or does it use the mirror to investigate its own body? And if it does the latter, then it's passed the mirror test. This doesn't happen until babies are about 18 months old. It's continually getting a bit earlier. My colleague Sid Quida in Paris has done clever experiments suggesting that babies can pass the mirror test as maybe a few months before that. But either way, even if the mirror test is not passed, and by the way, very few non-human animals show signs of passing the mirror test. But even if you don't pass the mirror test, this does not mean you're not conscious. It just means you don't have this elaborated, reflective element of self-awareness. So when does consciousness itself, when does consciousness, pure consciousness, arise? That is very difficult to say. It's extremely hard to do the relevant experiments, because when you get very early in development, difficult to get babies to tell you what's going on, if anything. Yeah. There are some clever ways to do it, but it's largely, again, the same problem that we face in figuring out whether there's anything going on for a non-human animal when they lack language. My guess is it's pretty early, and the earliest conscious experiences are not likely to be vision, but they're likely to be perceptions, experiences of the body, moods and emotions and so on. Maybe sound.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And, it's interesting to think that how intertwined it is, our own awareness of ourselves with language, how our narratives begin to unfold as we create a story for themselves. So you mentioned right at the beginning this notion that when someone asks, "Who are you?" I just go ahead and I said, "Hey, I'm a podcast producer and I'm very curious and I studied this and that and I was born in X." So after reading your book, Anil, how should I approach the question of who are you?
Wow. That's something up to everybody individually, I think. But hopefully what people will take from the book is that, however you ultimately come to think of it, what you are is not this indivisible essence of you-ness that suddenly appeared in history at one point and then will vanish from history at another, maybe jump into another body or something like that. No, you are a process. You are a continually unfolding process of perceptions that become constructed by the brain for the purposes of keeping you alive, your body alive. You are a perception, a set of perceptions, in the same way that your experience of the world is a set of perceptions.
Wow. That's amazing. I hope in my next job interview, when they ask me this, they think, "Oh, wow, that makes sense," rather than...
I wouldn't recommend using these things in a job interview.
Yes. Anil, this has been, just mind-blowing. I will refer back to this conversation many times in the future. I cannot wait for your book being sold here in the United States. I cannot wait to gift it to my family, my friends, and everyone, so we all collectively hallucinate a better reality. Anil, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Alex. It's been a real pleasure. Best of luck with your podcast, and thanks again.
Thank you.